In the 1920s, Adolf Hitler promoted the idea of Lebensraum, living space. The German population was, he said, too great in every sense to be confined within its present borders. And he knew that Germany could spread in only one direction.
We National Socialists are ceasing the endless German movement to the south and west and leveling our gaze at the land in the east.
That war to seize the land in the east was a war of unfathomable cost. It was Adolf Hitler's war. On April 15th, 1943, Bletchley Park decrypted a message in which Hitler said of the coming offensive,
"The victory at Kursk must be a beacon to the world."
The increasing output of Soviet industry meant victory was far from assured. With only a quarter of the steel that was available to Germany, the Soviet Union produced more tanks, more guns, and more aircraft than Hitler's Reich. And Soviet soldiers were not defending a regime, but their homes.
I think more than 90% of all factories and plants were either evacuated or destroyed by Soviet authorities.
State-run canteens in relocated Soviet factories served food to an estimated 25 million people every day. And prioritizing essential war production had sometimes life-threatening and sometimes simply inconvenient side effects. The requisitioning of all available metal to make munitions meant that there were no new pots and pans. And Stalin did not flinch from the greatest hypocrisy if he thought it would help the war.
When he invited 3 Russian bishops to Kremlin in 1943, he understood what he was to do. He gave them the most important monasteries, which were closed by the Bolsheviks, and he gave them an opportunity to go to people, yes, to let these people come to churches.
The Soviet Union enjoyed one further material advantage: Lend-Lease.
Turning points are important, but behind these turning points we must look at efforts on all levels of the Soviet society. Economic ones, international ones, and help of the Allies. Lend-Lease was a very important part of the war, undeniable.
In December 1940, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had made a pledge.
We must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself.
With Lend-Lease extended to the Soviet Union, the arsenal of democracy supplied the USSR with just 4% of Soviet weapons. But it also sent more than 35,000 radio stations, 380,000 field telephones, 5,900 radio receivers, and motor transport that was critical to the Red Army's sustained momentum. After Stalingrad, Soviet partisans, who would by late 1943 control almost 60% of the occupied territory, became so effective, particularly at disrupting the railway network, that regular troops had to be detached to deal with them.
Якщо про територію України говорити, то можна сказати, що очевидно радянські партизани знищили можливо там до 30 тисяч противників, але це здебільшого були місцеві люди, а не німці, та.
We have to say about the crimes, they also destroyed a lot of local people, they killed them, but as for propaganda, it's just prohibited us to talk about that, but it's a very interesting topic.
In June, prior to Kursk, partisan successes behind Army Group Center included the destruction of 298 locomotives and 44 bridges. For the largest anti-partisan operation, Gypsy Baron, in May-June 1943, a full panzer corps was deployed.
Перед битвой под Курском партизаны Беларуси нанесли мощнейший удар по коммуникациям, немецким коммуникациям. Вот только в ночь с 3 на 4 августа 74 тысячи белорусских партизан вышли на железнодорожные коммуникации, нанесли удар.
A document produced at the Nuremberg war trials details results of the anti-partisan sweep in Belarus in June 1943. It lists 9,500 killed and 492 rifles captured, a disparity which can only suggest that the vast majority of those killed had nothing to do with armed resistance.
То, что касается особенно населения, которое находилось на зонах партизанских, зонах, где полностью контролировались партизанскими формированиями, партизанскими соединениями. Эти люди, даже находясь, живя в своих домах, они жили обычной жизнью. Их сюда не появлялись немецкие оккупационные формирования. Когда были преследования, когда начинались карательные экспедиции, как правило, мирное население действовало вместе с партизанами. Они вместе уходили в прорыв. Они вместе уходили и пытались прорываться вместе. То есть они шли единой колонной фактически.
Erich Koch, Reichskommissar in Ukraine, said he was in favor of
punishment and reprisals, even when no direct provocation for such exists.
And on June 21st, his administration declared the whole of Ukraine a gang-fighting area. When the tide turned, Reichskommissar Erich Koch ran away. Recognized and brought to trial, he was, in 1959, sentenced to death, but not executed, because Polish law forbade capital punishment of the gravely ill. Erich Koch died in prison in 1986. Partisan action bought time for 300,000 Soviet civilians to prepare 9,000 kilometers of trenches, extending for up to 300 kilometers in front of Kursk. The German offensive, they named it Citadel, was also compromised by the dispatch of Axis troops from the Eastern Front to Italy, an obvious invasion target, following the surrender of German and Italian troops in North Africa.
We cannot allow a second front to develop on the Reich's frontiers.
On the day of Operation Citadel, Hitler sent a message to his troops.
This day, you are to take part in an offensive of such importance that the whole future of the war may depend on its outcome.
German plans, deciphered at Bletchley Park, had been sent to Moscow. So 2 hours and 20 minutes before the time set for their attack, the Germans came under intense Soviet bombardment. At 3:30 a.m., and without the element of surprise, the Germans moved forward along a 320-kilometer front. Axis forces of 780,000 faced a Red Army strength of 1,900,000 on a battlefield the size of Wales. In the opening 45 minutes, the Germans fired more shells than they had discharged during the Polish and French campaigns combined. Facing them was 40% of the Red Army's manpower and 75% of its armor.
Як раніше казали в радянській традиції, було зламано хребет німецьким бронетанковим військам. Радянське командування одночасно використало декілька факторів. Вони знали, що німецький наступ буде в районі Курську. Вони знали це за декілька місяців. Це призведе до того, що буде побудована одна з найпотужніших ліній укріплень за всю Другу світову війну. Вона буде насичена мінами, протитанковими гарматами, вона буде підкріплена резервами танків, резервами авіації.
By the 7th of July, Modell's forces in the north and Hoth's in the south seemed close to choking the neck of the salient and perhaps winning the battle. But progress slowed. Hoth was obliged to throw in his reserves on the 10th, and on the 11th, Zhukov and Vasilevsky began their counterattack.
І коли німецькі війська вранці 5 липня 43 року почнуть наносити удари як з півночі, так і з півдня, вони фактично загрузнуть в радянській протитанковій обороні. Ще одним додатковим фактором стане те, що німецькі танки, вони мали величезну кількість недоліків в ходовій частині. Наприклад, німецькі винищувачі танків «Елефант», на них просто конструктори забули встановити кулемети. І радянська піхота, їх не могла знищити радянська артилерія, але їх могла знищити радянська піхота, яка до них підбиралася і просто закидувала їх гранатами.
When the Soviet armored reserve was brought up, the tank battle the Russians called Prokhorovska-Poboish, the slaughter at Prokhorovka, took place.
Між німецькими військами, Курском і далі Москвою нікого не буде. І ось саме в цей момент радянське командування, воно йде ва-банк. Назустріч німцям кидаються дві армії, 5-та армія і 5-та танкова армія. Відбудеться танковий бій під Прохоровкою.
Recent research has cast doubt on the accepted story of Prokhorovka. The statement that over 500 German tanks, including more than 100 Tigers, took part is now considered inflated. Soviet myth-making swelling the numbers and boosting the glory.
This supposedly great tank battle at Prokhorovka, which is actually an incredibly one-sided conflict where the Soviet armor is largely obliterated for, as the historiography would now suggest, something like 5 German tanks lost, so 400 versus 5.
By the 14th, it was clear that the Germans could not achieve their objectives, and Hitler told his commanders that Citadel was to be called off.
That is the last time I will take the advice of my general staff.
By the numbers, Germany had the best of Kursk. Russian armor lost to German in the ratio of 5-1. Heinz Guderian called Kursk
a decisive defeat.
Kursk is only one part of this summer offensive, and typically that's where a lot of the books end. They just talk about Kursk. But actually there are rolling Soviet offensives that are now going to come up right through the second part of the summer and the autumn into the winter and liberate a far wider area of front. I mean, hundreds of kilometers. It sort of falls into this area of a whole plethora of forgotten battles. And these are very large-scale battles. And we're talking millions of men clashing together and huge amounts of casualties.
On July 16th, the Germans began to withdraw from Kursk. 8 days later, the Allies having landed in Sicily, Mussolini was deposed and arrested. After suffering 96,000 casualties, Hungarian head of state, Admiral Orti, recalled all but 2 of the 10 Hungarian light infantry divisions. The Slovaks followed suit. The 125,000 survivors of the 220,000-strong Italian 8th Army returned home. By July, Finland and Romania were considering their best interests, and the Axis was threatening to disintegrate. On August 1st, following Kursk, Joseph Stalin visited the front in a train that was armed, specially equipped, and rather preposterously camouflaged with birch branches. Despite propaganda to the contrary, including laughably heroic scenes in sentimental Soviet movies, it was his only such visit. Hitler never visited the front. Following the Belgorod-Kharkov operation, Stalin ordered the first artillery salute in Moscow.
In the name of our country, our capital, Moscow, will today salute our glorious troops with 12 artillery salutes from 124 guns.
Von Manstein, commanding the army, predicted that after Kursk, the Red Army would not be able to quickly transition to the offensive. The following day, 100 Soviet divisions fell on Army Group South in Operation Rumiantsev. By mid-August, Hitler had given permission for the construction of a new defensive line, the Panther Line, to be built by forced labor. From Narva on the Gulf of Finland to the Sea of Azov near Melitopol.
Why bothering anymore? There's not going to be a conquest. It's one of the things I struggled with, actually. I, for a long time, tried to understand this war in sort of rational terms. But you only have to understand it as they understood it. And if they are operating in a worldview that requires you to sort of suspend rational ideas, that's fine, so long as you understand how they construct their world.
4 days after Hitler's Panther Line decision, German forces surrounded the Bialystok ghetto. At 3, several hundred SS troops entered the ghetto. By 5, notices had been posted instructing the remaining Jews to assemble. Young Jews from the ghetto's combat organization yelled at their fellow Jews to resist. The Germans brought in tanks. Some Jews managed to escape. Most did not. By August 20th, the ghetto at Bialystok and the Jewish community that had been in the town since 1745 had ceased to exist.
There isn't a single aspect of day-to-day life that doesn't have some sort of Jewish rule or practice associated with it. Why is all of this important to God is a very deep question, which people have been asking for a very long time. It's not our place to second-guess the mind of God.
On August 21st, in an uprising chiefly by the forced labor Sonder commandos, about 300 prisoners broke out of Treblinka. Less than 3 months later, a Jewish Soviet prisoner of war, Alexander Pecheski, and a Polish Jew, Leon Fellhender, led 600 inmates of the death camp at Sobibor against their captors. Armed with knives and hatchets, they killed 11, stormed the fence, and ran. 200 were gunned down as they ran. 300 were trapped and killed at the wire. 100 made it into the forests, where many joined partisan units whose efforts were growing bolder. The Chief of Transportation for Army Group Center, in reporting on the events of August 1943, explained the problem.
Partisan activity increased by 25% during August and reached a record of 1,392 incidents.
The report notes that these were
sabotage acts committed chiefly by native workers under partisan orders.
A particular issue was with what the Chief of Transportation described as
so-called volunteer units employed to protect the railway lines.
Manpower shortages forced the Germans to employ more than 100,000 Soviet railway workers, many to provide protection. They, to put it colloquially, legged it with their German weapons.
An entire Russian security detachment of 600 men went over to the partisans. They attacked the Krylevshchina railway station using the machine guns, mortars and anti-tank guns which they had taken with them. The Russians caused considerable damage.
On the southern part of Belarus, there are a lot of swamps. These territories, it was very useful partisans to create camps and to take under the control these territories.
And if the column, German column, need to pass through the swamps and through the forests, the partisans needed to shoot the first car and the last car. Germans paralyzed. They cannot do anything. They jump in the swamp, they die.
On August 22nd, German forces withdrew from Kharkov. the fourth time the city had changed hands in 2 years. In 4 days, 200 villages and hamlets south of Bryansk were liberated. The Chernigov-Poltava operation sent 3 of the Red Army's most effective commanders towards Kiev. By the end of August, Ukraine, which had been the USSR's greatest loss, an area of more than 530,000 square kilometers, rich in assets, was being reoccupied.
70% сільськогосподарської продукції Райху в роки Другої світової війни становило вивезено з терену країни.
On September 8th, Hitler flew to the headquarters of Army Group South at Zaporozhye. After a briefing, he flew back to Rastenburg and took an afternoon nap, from which he was roused with the news that Italy had surrendered. In a radio broadcast 3 days later, Hitler tried to be reassuring.
The collapse of Italy has been foreseen for a long time because of those elements who, to crown systematic sabotage, have now brought about capitulation. The nation which passes this test set by Providence will be rewarded by the Almighty with the laurels of victory. This must and will be Germany.
Hitler sent troops into Italy as the Wehrmacht in the east continued to pull back.
Одночасно з цим німецькі війська починають використовувати тактику випаленої землі. Відступаючи, вони нищать все. Запаси продовольства, залізниці, запаси пального і так далі. І в цих же територіях, в цих же умовах радянські війська поступово наближаються до Дніпра.
Himmler said that in retreat, the Scorched Earth policy had to include Menschenvernichtung, the destruction of people. In May, Hitler approved Himmler's proposal to liquidate the remaining Jewish population in the occupied territories.
It is good that we had the toughness to exterminate Jews in our domain.
Between 5 and 9 times a day, loads of 50 victims, alive at departure, dead on arrival, were delivered by gas van to the charnel house of Babi Yar in Kiev. One consignment was 100 naked young women from a brothel. Young women who would never tell their story, and with a detail of hundreds of prisoners, exhuming and burning more than 100,000 corpses in that place, the Germans did what they could to make sure that Babi Yar too never told its story. Meanwhile, negotiations with Admiral Orti were underway for the destruction of the 800,000 Hungarian Jews, until then protected by his regime.
It's clear that any resource that Germany can muster to support the war is important. At the same time, the Holocaust isn't the difference between victory or defeat for the Germans. I'm sure of that.
The argument, had Germany not pursued the Jews to the extent they did, maybe they would have won the war. It's a non-starter. This was Nazi Germany, and they pursued the Jews in this way because they were Nazi Germany.
By summer 1943, all 4 of the crematoria gas chamber complexes at Auschwitz-Birkenau were operating. Rail wagons brought the victims to Auschwitz and departed loaded with loot. Treasure that included 6 tons of dental gold. At Auschwitz, they collected between 8 and 9 kilograms every day. In Minsk in September, Yelena Grigorievna Mazanik assassinated Wilhelm Kuba, Generalkommissar for Vice-Ruthenian. A partisan, she had managed to find employment as one of his maids, smuggled in a small magnetic mine and attached it to his bed.
Немцы сюда хотели, чтобы был парад, знакомитый німецький паради. І у даденому випадку насельніцтво ведало, що за забойство некого представника місцевої нават адміністрації будуть спочатку арештовані, а потім закатовані, там 10, 20 і так далі, представників насильництва.
For what sort of man was such vengeance exacted? In July 1941, Kuba had sent Berlin a rather whining complaint.
Army Group Center has, without consulting me, liquidated 10,000 Jews whose systematic extermination we had already planned.
During the 1942 Purim holiday, the jolliest Jewish holiday, when people dress up and eat pastries called Hamantaschen, Wilhelm Kuba stood immaculate in his uniform as German and Belarusian policemen threw Jewish children from the Spalerna Street orphanage into a deep sandpit. Lacking Hamantaschen, Kuba threw handfuls of sweets to the children, who screamed as sand was shoveled on top of them.
Коли был забитый Куба, больше чем 1000 мирных жихаров было знищено.
It was perhaps to actions such as the Spalerna Street outrage that Heinrich Himmler was referring when, addressing SS leaders in Poznan in October, he spoke of
a page of glory in our history, which has never been written and shall never be written.
In the same vein, Hitler had told party leaders,
everything that can be discussed should never be put in writing. Never.
The fact that there's no paper trail leading back to Hitler, this was intentional, because he made that mistake in 1939 with the letter of authorization he gave for the murder of the physically and mentally handicapped in Germany. And Hitler was certainly not going to make the same mistake again.
Talking to the same SS audience a few weeks later and in the same place, Himmler addressed a page of glory that could not be written but had perhaps caused disquiet.
I did not feel justified in exterminating the men while allowing the avengers in the form of their children to grow up in the middle of our sons and grandsons. We collectively have done this for our people, have taken the responsibility on ourselves. The responsibility for a deed, not just an idea. And we then carry the secret with us to our graves.
His audience is reported to have greeted Himmler's speech with generous applause. And then the killing started of the 45,000 survivors of the Warsaw Ghetto. The place was Majdanek, and the victims were shot, as many as 18,000 on a single day at the start of Aktion Erntefest, Operation Harvest Festival. The killers were mainly volunteers from German Reserve Police Battalion 101, commanded by that Hitler favorite, Odilo Globocnik.
Zmieniała się sytuacja w okupowanym mieście. W jakiej mierze, w jaki sposób, w którą stronę? Otóż na początku okupacji starano się te egzekucje przeprowadzać poza miastem, żeby nie było, że tak powiem, śladów miejsc. I co pokazuje, że tak powiem, skalę narastania terroru, to jest nagle jesień 1943 roku, kiedy Niemcy rozstrzeliwują warszawiaków na ulicach miasta.
Globocnik was transferred to anti-partisan duties in northern Italy, where he established a concentration camp in a disused rice factory. Captured by the British, Globocnik used his cyanide pill. Soviet troops had crossed the Dnieper between Kremenchug and Dnipropetrovsk in late June, and Goebbels wrote,
"We are in danger of slowly bleeding to death in the east."
Batutin, having assembled a force north of Kiev, burst from his bridgehead on November 3rd. The Germans set charges, destroying significant Kievan buildings. Nikita Khrushchev, who had been head of the Communist Party in Ukraine before the war, returned to Kiev and recalled,
As we were walking along Lenin Street, we suddenly heard a hysterical scream, and a young man came running towards us. He kept shouting, "I'm the only Jew left. I'm the last Jew in Kiev."
2 days after the fall of Kiev, Hitler delivered his annual Bierkeller speech and came close to admitting the truth.
The struggle in the East is the most difficult that the German Volk has ever had to fight. What our men bear here cannot be compared with what our enemies achieve. Not only will it not be possible to reach the final objective, namely, to bring about the collapse of the German front, but also, as always in world history, the final battle alone will bring about the decision. What I demand of the German soldier is therefore tremendous. It is the task of the homeland to support and reinforce the front in its struggle against the apparently impossible.
Із початком 44-го року розпочалися військові операції Червоної армії на правобережній Україні. Частина з них проводилася в контексті так званих 10 сталінських ударів.
The Soviet sequence of offensives, Stalin's 10 crushing blows that punctuate the new year, owes its label to Stalin himself. Speaking at the celebration of the 27th anniversary of the October Revolution, he said,
"The decisive successes of the Red Army this year and the expulsion of the Germans from Soviet territory were predetermined by the succession of shattering blows which our troops dealt the German forces."
The first blow, given that rank because Stalin named it first, was the Leningrad-Novgorod operation, launched on January 14, 1944.
In 1944, Stalin, he was not a great war chief, as it's a legend created by himself. But nevertheless, he understood how the army should be directed. He tried to create a team of people that helped him to wage this war.
A surge pushed Manstein back to within 30 kilometers of the Polish border and liberated 300 towns and villages. On January 6th, Red Army units crossed the old Polish border and took Rokitno. At the turn of 1943-44, Ribbentrop, according to his own memoirs, was told by Hitler to stop attempting diplomatic feelers through Sweden.
If I settled with Russia today, I would only come to grips with her again tomorrow. I just can't help it.
Army Group North was attacked on January 15, 1944, by the Leningrad, Volkhov, and 2nd Baltic fronts, which broke through the ring around Leningrad, linking with units coming from the east at the village of Ropska. On the 18th, the encirclement of Leningrad was broken, at the cost of 34,000 Soviet casualties. On the 20th, before the guns were moved out of range, the last German shells fell on the city. A week later, the Moscow-Leningrad railway line was cleared, ending the 876-day siege, the bloodiest in history, in which civilians died at the rate of 1,100 each day, more deaths than the combined British and American death toll for the entire war. In late January 1944, a significant battle raged on the Great Dnieper Bend, where Zhukov and Konev trapped 2 German army corps in a salient from which Manstein managed to extricate them at the loss of 100,000 casualties. Yet the Battle of Korsun is barely known in the West. The Soviet spring offensive began with a setback when, on the 28th of February, one of the Red Army's most able commanders, Nikolai Vatutin, was assassinated by members of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, the separatist group that had gained ascendancy among the partisans.
Всі ці партизанські групи, партизанські угруповання армії, вони мали різні тактичні і різні стратегічні завдання. І вони були по-різному побудовані в своїй структурі. Радянські партизани, вони мали стратегічним завданням розгром нацистської Німеччини і її союзників і поновлення радянської влади на території України. Крім всього іншого, вони мали або на території Білорусі, чи інших територіях, які німці окупували.
By April, the Red Army had advanced 265 kilometers. The most productive land in the USSR was back in Soviet hands. And Stalin and the Stavka were planning the campaign that would finally eject the invader from Soviet soil. Operation Bagration. As Soviet forces moved west, it was not peace, but more pain that was in store for many of the liberated people.
Польські національні партизани оперували на території сучасної Західної Білорусі, яка до війни Другої світової була частиною міжвоєнної Речі Посполитої. Так само з приходом чи з поверненням, з наближенням Червоної армії на ці території, скажімо, в Литві, в Латвії, Естонії з'явилися свої національні партизани, які починають уже боротьбу як проти німців на пізньому етапі, так і проти радянської влади з її поверненням.
From February 1944, Soviet deportations sent Chechen, Ingush, Tatar, Balkar, and more around the vast country under the direction of Stalin's infamous secret police chief, Lavrenti Beria. 1.5 million people were uprooted, taken on trains, and dumped. As many as 500,000 died on their journeys or soon after arrival. A report from Beria dated March 11, 1944, captures the callous nature of the deportations.
37,103 Balkars have been loaded onto special trains and dispatched to their new areas of settlement in the Kazakh and Kyrgyz republics. There were no incidents requiring attention during the operation.
But then Beria always told Stalin that, and it was never true. In May, the NKVD began deportation of 180,000 Crimean Tatars. When almost 500,000 Chechens were deported, Beria claimed
there were only isolated cases of attempted flight.
Of course, there was a death toll caused by his NKVD. It tallied in the thousands. In early March, Allied bombers made the first major daylight bombing raid on Berlin. But cities are easier to burn down than to blow up. And Berlin, with extensive parks and wide boulevards, proved difficult to burn down. On the day of the raid, Soviet troops began the offensive that would drive the Axis out of Belarus.
Я имею в виду ту человеческую трагедию, которая измеряется бесконечными цифрами. Цифрами, за которыми, к сожалению, сегодня мы не всегда имеем имена людей или трагедии людей здесь, в Беларуси. 2 357 000.
Це такий військовий вимір України в Другій світовій війні, саме в лавах радянської армії. 7 мільйонів призвані, 3,5 мільйони загинув. Кожен другий з призваних в радянську армію з України загинув. З 41 мільйону населення зменшилось до 27 мільйонів.
Rattled by the suspicion that Hungary was about to follow Italy and seek peace, Hitler authorized Operation Margareta, the occupation of Hungary. 2 mechanized divisions, followed by SS and police, entered the country. 800,000 Jews, a quarter of them in Budapest, protected from deportation by Admiral Ortiz regime, were still there. But suddenly, they were in great danger. The troops entered Hungary on March 19th, and so did Adolf Eichmann, who moved into Budapest's Hotel Majestic, soon changing to a villa stolen from its Jewish owner. There, Eichmann worked closely with the Hungarian government through 2 secretaries of state, Laszlo Endre and Laszlo Baki. drawing up plans for the deportation of Hungary's Jews. Hitler said,
Hungary, the entire country subverted and rotten, Jews everywhere. Here too I intervened, and this problem is now going to be solved.
On May 10th, the New York Times told its readers, Hungarian Jews fear annihilation. The deportation to Auschwitz-Birkenau of Hungarian Jews began on May 15th, the culmination of 2 months' planning and triggering the camp's most intense killing period, as between 70% and 90% of those on the transports were sent directly to the gas chambers. American bombers dropped leaflets on Budapest, which said that the United States government viewed with extreme gravity the persecution of the Jews, and Admiral Orty advised Germany that it would have to stop. It stopped on July 8th. More than 170,000 Jews remained in Budapest, but by then, 434,351 Hungarian Jews had been deported aboard 147 trains.
It's not only the Jews that are living close to the extermination camps, but it's worth having deportation trains from Western Europe, from Hungary, go to Auschwitz.
Throughout the final solution, the Reich Main Transport Office paid the railways for transporting the victims to the camps. It paid half fare for children. Stalin's third blow, the Odessa offensive, launched on March 26th. Ivan Konev, in 1956 he would command the Soviet troops that suppressed the Hungarian uprising, drove his command 240 kilometers across Ukraine, culminating on April 7th with his troops entering Botoșani in Romania. It was the first time Red Army boots had tramped on foreign soil since the fighting began 34 months earlier. On the 8th, Soviet forces advanced into the Crimea. In only 2 days, Odessa fell. On the 17th, Ternopil fell to Zhukov. Hitler had declared Ternopil to be a fortress, a Führerfestung, and the 4,500-man garrison defended it accordingly. "55 Germans survived the assault. On June 6th, D-Day, the second front opened. 1/6 of the German 7th Army, facing the invasion on the Normandy beaches, comprised troops recruited during the invasion of the USSR. There were Tatars, Cossacks, Georgians and the like.
Overlord is a source of joy to us all. Tomorrow we begin the first round on the Leningrad front.
What's interesting is the Allies in the West, who are facing in total about 58 German divisions, and actually in Normandy it's about 15 divisions that they're directly engaged with, and they're tied up in Normandy and they haven't yet broken out. And on the Eastern Front, the Germans with Axis allies have about 228 divisions.
The Germans, engaged on 2 fronts, were still obliged to mount major operations against partisans. On June 19th, demolition charges placed by Soviet partisans so damaged the railway network west of Minsk that it could not be repaired. Other attacks disrupted Germany's ability to resupply and reinforce.
Партизанів радянських це теж були цивільні, це були місцеві, які співпрацювали з німцями. Хто пішов служити в поліцію, хто пішов працювати на якусь адміністративну роботу і так далі.
On the night of the 19th, 20th of June, partisan attacks put more than 1,000 transport nodes out of action. All of this merely a prologue to the main show, which would start on the 22nd. 2 senior staff officers, Sergei Shtumenko and Semyon Timoshenko, had been tasked with considering the pros and cons of offensive action in the northern, central, or southern parts of the line. Their conclusion persuasively argued for the concentration of forces in the center. So the fifth and most devastating blow fell there. Operation Bagration.